The Griffins were unusual people. Their great legacy is this imaginative engagement with how to live, the possibilities of living, and how they opened the eyes of Australians to deeply love our country instead of seeing it from a colonial point of view as a place to exploit. If only that was universally accepted today, we'd be in good shape.
Marion Mahony Griffin and Walter Bailey Griffin had such a clear vision of what they wanted this suburb to be and what they protected of the natural world here. We're so lucky to have the benefit of that today. Marion's legacy permeates the suburb and the community, and she has left a big part of herself here. And whether you're walking through the gardens or the streets, those are her streets, and this is her community that she built, and we're very lucky to have the benefit of her vision.
Well, Castlecrag, sort of in a negative way, grew out of the debacle of the Canberra project, which towards the end of 1920 was really starting to fold up.
Griffin had been looking for land to do some work on Sydney Harbour. I think from the moment he saw Sydney Harbour when he arrived in 1913, he wanted to do something on Sydney Harbour. He had found an amazing site to carry out a whole series of garden suburbs. There was 650 acres of land on Middle Harbour, the better part of 3 peninsulas. The story goes that they offered a price for the first peninsula, and the London-based debenture holders accepted it for all 3. So he got the land for 1/3 of what he'd been looking at in other parts of the harbour.
Griffin formed what was called the Greater Sydney Development Association, which was an association of shareholders. The land was actually purchased in early 1921. Lots were sold in November of that year. The first houses were built in 1922. A lot of covenants were imposed on buyers of the land. What the Griffins were intent on doing was maintaining the beauty of the natural environment.
It's really working with the bush in its, for the most part, in good condition. The top of the ridge at Castlecrag had been cleared and devastated with goats and people taking bush rock and so on. That had to be restored, but the rest of that site was in beautiful condition. So the whole thing was planned as a contour road garden suburb with the waterfront dedicated to public use. And so ultimately Griffin's company dedicated 4 miles of absolute waterfront on Sydney Harbour. It's the greatest gift to the citizens of Sydney of all time. The value of that land today would be astronomical. And then within the system of roads and so forth, there was threaded through a marvellous park system that protected the streams, protected the cliffs, protected the significant trees. And so about 20% of the land was a network of open space with its own marvellous walkways through all of that.
It's what gives Castlecrag its character now. You drive from the city and you get out of the car and you can smell the lemon-scented gums, many of which the Griffins planted.
The marvellous contoured roads that are set within the sandstone ledges and at times sort of entrenched within the sandstone. So Griffin cut them in like the ancient roads of Japan, is how he described them. They're marvellous. They're narrow and idiosyncratic and beautiful and have survived.
So apart from the environmental aspects of the estate, they wanted it to be a community of like-minded people. Residents who enjoyed the bush, enjoyed the same sort of things as they did, who were interested in art, literature, culture of all kinds, would enjoy bushwalking, and the residents went out on regular planting trips so that they were in fact enhancing the natural bush with species of indigenous plants. It was a very free kind of community, but I think it was also, there was a kind of spiritual aspect to it. They had very high ideals about how a community could work together, I guess, to make the most of the local environment and make the most of their own society. The shareholders and original buyers of the land at Castlecrag tended to be not particularly wealthy people. Most of the houses were very simple, quite often not more than 2 bedrooms, very basic kitchens, but the view was everything. So verandas, roof terraces that were designed to be used as recreation areas were very important, as was the garden, and very few of the houses had fences. If there were fences in the Griffins' time in Castlecrag, it was usually to keep out the cattle that were allowed to roam in some of the paddocks further down Edinburgh Road. So, you know, there were no interruptions to the bushland.
One of the great motivating forces in the lives of both Walter and Marion Griffin was their love of nature that comes out of their respective childhoods. And so these were formative influences on their life, and that's what they could see Australia needed. Australia needed to be at one with its land instead of this colonial mentality of dominating and destroying the land. And so they looked at Sydney Harbour with all of its red tile roofs around on the hillside, and they described this as erysipelas, as a skin disease, a terrible disease over this beautiful landscape of bushland of Sydney Harbour. So the idea that you would have buildings subservient to landscape is a fundamental idea of Castlecrag. If only it was still the case. And if they had been able to build more, there would have been, I think, a very convincing demonstration of that principle. Probably there are designs for about 50 or 60 houses, but only 14 or 15 actually got built. Some have been encroached upon, some have had a lot of additions and changes, and some have been lost, actually. But the ones that have the house sitting within its landscape, they have this incredible strangeness about them that really talks to a totally different set of values than normal Australian suburban values.
The Fishwick house is by far the most elaborate, the largest. It's a couple of stories and it incorporates lots of very interesting features that required, funding to include.
There I think you can see what Griffin would have achieved if he could get more houses of that scale and with that sensitivity and understanding of just how to live with the bush.
I think we must have loved it in spite of its terrible condition, because it had, even then when it had leaking ceilings and everything painted white, it still had a feeling, an ambience that was quite different. Really, that we had no interest in Griffin at all. We just wanted a house that we wanted to be in for a long time. I think we decided then and there to buy it. The first thing we had to do when we moved in was stabilise the roof as much as we could, because that was like leaking like a sieve. So all that had to happen, and we didn't even think about heritage because nobody did.
The house has always had leaking problems, but we're on top of it. We have the world's largest supply of old beach towels, and that fixes everything.
If you own a house like this, you have to maintain it and keep the leaks under control, otherwise it'll just disintegrate.
There's a sewer line running straight underneath the lounge room here, and the water coming from rain, there's downpipes, had to come inside the house because Griffin didn't want any gutters or downpipes showing. And they were also brought down into
terracotta pipes.
So that we had a trapdoor here underneath this couch where we'd have to send, what do they call those things?
About every month we'd go to Kennard's hire place at Willoughby, hire an eel, lift up the trapdoor, and I'd get down there,
pull out the rubbish.
The roots.
So something had to happen. So we found a heritage architect who knew what a heritage job needed to be done and how it should be done properly.
And it gave us the courage to do it.
For example, he forced us, a bit of a hard word, but he did, to scrape every single surface in every single room to try to determine what the original colouring was. So pretty much the textures and colours are as you would have seen them back in 1929. When you stand in front of the house, all you see is this dark passage. And as you walk down the passage, it's very strange because the side panels are made of amber glass which have been mirrored. It's dark and it's claustrophobic, perhaps. And then you open up the door and you come into the entry area. When you move through that, it's still low and all the light is amber coming from various skylights. And
very low ceiling,
very
actually.
Low ceilings. But then come under a pelmet and then suddenly the ceiling is much, much higher, the room is much bigger, and it's all bright and light.
It's rather dramatic and artistic and almost creates a theatrical entrance. And you could imagine Marion thinking this would be a great way to approach a house. For the light, I love the bedroom, but the study, I think, is a room
that's everybody's favourite.
That's
room.
everyone's favourite.
One of the dominant pieces of design is the fireplace in the lounge room, whereas this one is spectacular and bold. There's another one upstairs which is very, very classical in its look and very understated. The third one is cut from almost a cube with planes cut through it. It's very, very geometric. And the final one has the tiles. It's all very colourful and playful. So here are 4 different functional things.
Completely different.
Completely different. When we're showing people around the house, one of the big moments for me is always when I take them into the dining area and I point up and I say, they were once fish ponds. I don't think they lasted very long.
No.
It was probably only 18 months and they were turned into skylights. Yes.
Walter had a lot of interesting ideas that in the end weren't quite so practical, but you can't deny his efforts in trying to make something beautiful. But the house gives you such a feeling of joy. I've got a friend that comes, she said, I always feel good when I come into this house. It just makes you feel fine. And I think Walter and Marion's vision of having a house work for you and be part of the environment, it really works.
The house has character. It isn't just like anybody else's house. It's full of extraordinary things, new things and odd things and strange things. It's a great place to live.
Yeah.
Walter and Marion really complemented each other, but they were very different personalities, and I think that's why, as a collaboration, as a partnership, they worked so well together.
Well, a great description of the Griffins was given by Eric Nichols, who worked with them for many years, and he described Griffin as the thought and Marion as the will. There's no question that Marion's dynamic and driving personality permeates all of the Griffins' work. So I think that Griffin had a great capacity for ideas, but he wasn't by any means the sort of draftsman or delineator that Marion was. And Marion could realise his ideas, and so together they worked brilliantly.
Their spirituality, their democratic principles, their ideas about nature, about the place of human beings in the environment. From the very beginning, they both shared the same sorts of principles. And I think that was the cement that held them together throughout their lives. In spite of incredible odds, you know, the debacle at Canberra, the difficulties of some of these very significant projects they did, particularly in Melbourne, but also Castlecrag in Sydney, you know, having to deal with councils and clients, and, you know, just through sheer force of will, I guess, and personality, being able to implement these very innovative, pioneering ideas in their buildings.
Well, my parents, they were always told, buy something with a view, it's good property to have. This had a pretty good view. was an absolute wreck of a house by that time, only 25 years old, but it hadn't weathered well in the Sydney Australian climate. My father, he spent the next 6 years renovating the house in a true farmer style with not very suitable materials because they just weren't about after the war, but it became somewhat more inhabitable, less leaky.
We now have a tin roof. It must have been a bit different when it had the concrete tiles on the roof, partly because you experienced the weather more then too. did have a bit of a leaking problem at that point.
Yes, yes, it did. When we first came, my mother had all her saucepans and buckets and so on here in this courtyard because it was a very primitive covering.
Back in the 1920s, this was an atrium. It was called the Atrium Villa, wasn't it, Ron?
Yes, there was just the eaves around the side, so you'd walk around there with an umbrella to go from one side to the other side of the atrium, more or less, or hurry.
Get to the kitchen or
Yes.
the bathroom. Yes.
But I guess it'd be good for people who only came along in the summer and lived in the house. But in the other rooms, there's 5 sort of cathedral-type ceilings which give the impression and the feeling of so much more space, which is pretty different, very modern in those times. Well, as you see it now, is hopefully more like people would have seen it after it was built. It lent itself to restoring it somehow as though it wanted to be. Because it is a person, well, it has a character and a soul, the house, definitely.
Marion was a larger-than-life personality. She was filled with passion, with energy. Where does it come from? It comes from a very special childhood, a very supportive environment under difficult circumstances. She clearly revered her father, but he died when she was about 12 years old. And her mother then supported the family and was part of a very incredible feminist network in Chicago itself. And then Marion had a benefactress who supported her going to MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, to study architecture. And she was the second woman to graduate from the full 5-year course at MIT in 1894. She went on to become the first woman in the world to become a licensed architect by examination. And that was considered quite remarkable. The Royal Institute of British Architects Journal commented, "Oh, a woman has passed the architectural exam." You know. So what she was up against is incredible. Marion had 50 years in architecture, from the 1890s to the 1940s. So she really is an amazing pioneer in a very male-dominated world, I can assure you, to this day. But certainly the foundation of her values and her spirit comes from her mother and her mother's circle.
I grew up in this house. 5 generations of my family have lived in this house. When I was a child, I lived here with people who had lived in the 1800s. Mrs. Wilson was the first owner. She apparently had this room specially designed to have soirees in it. She sold it to my father during the war. They've seen a lot of things, these walls. Of course, they've seen the Griffins, the soirees and the discussion groups and the play readings and the kids running through and the parties, and yeah, and there is a feeling of stored memories in the house. The living room's probably the most famous part of the house. It's a wonderful room to sit in, beautiful light, and it's just a very lovely space to work in as well. It's a nice place to welcome people to come here. Of course, the roofs are so terrible. I remember as a child sitting right where you are now and just watching water pour down the walls, like waterfalls, and thinking, where are we going to go? Then my father getting on the old black telephone and calling up people, and then suddenly there was all scaffolding. But there's been 4 new roofs on this house since I've lived in it. Griffin houses are very much outside, inside. The architecture is subservient to the nature around it. The house is built on a huge stone platform, rock platform, and the stone, it's a very lovely natural feeling, as though it's growing out of the ground, and all the stone here was quarried on site. So it is a very wonderful spiritual type of house. So I think that's a big thank you to the Griffins.
Well, a very important part of the Griffin story is the connection that both Walter and Marion had with the great Frank Lloyd Wright. And the first great phase of his career in Chicago, Marion was there basically the whole time.
Marion was the longest serving of Frank Lloyd Wright's employees. So she started to work for him in 1895, so the year after she graduated.
She was always a free spirit, and she would come and go in the daily running of the office.
There are many accounts of what Marion actually brought to the office, apart from her extraordinary design skills, and how much Wright depended on her beautiful renderings, you know, to promote his own work. That she was his intellectual match, that, you know, the days when she was in the office that, you know, sparks would fly and that there'd be very entertaining arguments.
Her ability to deal with Wright and his ego, her mordant wit, her great capacity to draw, and in a way that could inspire everybody else. And she did in fact teach so many of the other draftsmen in the office to render in the way that she did as well.
One of her greatest and probably most unique contributions, particularly when she was working for Frank Lloyd Wright, was the presentation style, the style of the drawings.
What Marion did was to learn from the Japanese print, and perhaps to a certain extent Chinese scrolls as well, and particularly to do it in pen and ink. And so the quality of the line and the way that that is worked through a whole series of pen and ink techniques of line work and stippling and dots and so forth, that then has the work of architecture poised within its landscape setting. So I think that there's some sort of a revelation of the essence of building mass and space, the integration of elements that is so clearly expressed in those pen and ink drawings.
She, you know, contributed an enormous amount to the Wright office. We know that from the accounts of people who worked with Marion. She was given little credit, very little credit, in fact none, from Frank Lloyd Wright, who I think called her a talented apprentice.
Certainly, as a woman, an early career woman, was so accomplished and you know, so passionate about what she did, but also, you know, able to break down boundaries that a lot of women in the time couldn't do. 3 years ago, we were looking for a new house, and we were looking for something with architectural integrity. We wanted something unusual. The idea of being able to be the custodian of a home that is important and mold our lifestyle around the house, that adds a richness to our lifestyle that we wouldn't have had we bought a new house.
Yeah, my parents were Frank and Annis Duncan. They came out from England, from Manchester, in 1927. Soon after they got here, they heard about Castlecrag and the Griffins. In those days, towards the end of the Depression, it was very hard to borrow any money on an unusual Griffin house. And there was a few years before they actually built this. It was the smallest of the Griffin houses, but it was all that my parents could afford at the time.
From us coming upon the house, our approach to it is a mixture of restoration in the heritage part of the house and renovation in the extension part of the house to ensure that we are respectful to the hero, which is this Duncan house.
It was built shortly before I was born, virtually 1.5 bedroom, and soon after they built it, my parents added an extra bedroom on, and the people who bought it from my father, they more than doubled the size of the house. My father used to get up regularly on the roof and paint it with bitumen paints. Flat roofs do invariably leak, but generally it was a comfortable house.
There are quirks to it. There are complexities. There are days when, if it's raining a lot and it might be raining down the front of our fireplace, it's really frustrating. But I wouldn't trade it for a new house in a second because it's so special, and you know, we're willing to compromise our lifestyle a little bit to have the pleasure that we have of living in this wonderful home.
We must also acknowledge that Griffin was always experimenting with different types of construction, and so there are real problems with some forms of construction that he indulged in at Castlecrag, and these houses are now, you know, nearly 100 years old, and so there are quite considerable maintenance and issues to do with those houses. So to take them on is a heroic challenge.
The commitment to living in a place like this is huge, isn't it?
Yes, you really have to want to do it. You have to have a long view.
We need to be quite thoughtful about what we do because the house it has constraints.
Somehow it feels like the burden of heritage is unfairly placed on the Griffin homeowners.
You know, some of my friends say, I love your house, but I wouldn't want to live in it, which I can understand. There's a lot of work and a lot of dedication to a place like this. You wouldn't live here unless you wanted to be here.
So we're in the Moon House, which my husband and I discovered in the 1970s when there was a wonderful open house day to celebrate Walter Burley Griffin's 100th anniversary of his birth. So I fell in love with the house and the beautiful Griffin Castlecrag landscape of reserves and walkways. The Moon House was designed for Chinua Moon, who was a Chinese herbalist, and he was a shareholder with the GSDA. He never lived here. As far as we know, he lived in Melbourne. The house itself is just very comfortable and easy to live in. The fireplace is internal. There's no external wall for the fireplace, so none of the heat is lost to an external wall. And the beautiful cabinets with their mirrors at the back reflect the light back into the room. The picture window was such a big piece of glass for that time. It's not in today's terms, but given that this house was built at the same time as Californian bungalows, and they're fairly relatively small windows, the house's big picture window is amazing. Even the skirting boards are unusual. They're proportions that are splayed out rather than just tall. To think that Griffin went to so much trouble just for one house, the details around the windows, the prism forms, they're all prefabricated forms. So I'm always in awe of them and how they have this wonderful textural contrast with the sandstone, the beautiful sandstone. The sandstone was all from the site. It was, you know, a sustainable way of building and living.
Well, the Canberra competition is the great achievement of their lives, and it happens just after their marriage. What we know about it is that the whole production of the drawings, which are phenomenal, happened in about 9 weeks between September and December 1911. Marion planned the whole presentation and oversaw its production. And so what we have is the very profound ideas of Griffin of how to create a democratic city for a new democratic nation that found realization in these phenomenal drawings, because it was evoking something unique, something unusual, something that was distinctive for Australia, imagined completely from Chicago, grounded in the Griffin's political and social ideals at that time. They saw Australia as a sort of younger, purer version of the American movement of democracy.
Walter came out by himself first. Of course, he came by ship, and he fell in love with the harbour and extolled its beauty and its virtues, and told Sydney residents how lucky they were and how the local Indigenous plants, how artistic they were. So he was really affected. The Griffin's entry into the competition was quite unusual.
The fundamental idea of Griffin's plan for Canberra is based on trying to make the experience of the city be meaningful for every citizen. Now, of course, you say that to an Australian today and they look at you as in astonishment, because Canberra seems so baffling. But that's because other people built it, not Griffin. And the original idea is so simple and so profound that it's a tragedy that it has never been followed.
There was constant bureaucratic interference in Griffin's designs. He was very reluctant to make the kind of compromises they were asking of him.
The opposition that Griffin had to endure was substantial. I mean, he was ultimately put up before a royal commission, and how he defended himself under those circumstances is magnificent. Some of his writings are very bitter, in fact, about politicians and what they had done to his plan. Many people who knew him say that he didn't really show that in his personal life, but you can look in his writings and you can see that there's a great wound there. And so both Walter and Marion then had to remake them themselves, and it was to Australia's immense cultural benefit that they stayed.
One of Marion's great contributions were the what she called forest portraits, paintings of trees that she'd encountered on some of her bushwalks.
They are perhaps her greatest creative achievement, and the feel of the Australian bush and how it's charged with a special energy, we'd have to say a spiritual energy, in how she's drawn the trees and the light effects. It's just extraordinary. And in terms of Castlecrag, perhaps the greatest creative work of Castlecrag is her drawing of the Angophora with the wonderful little stone house on the rock shelf up above Middle Harbour. That is superb. That is just a work of pure genius.
The Griffins had serious sounding ideals, but they also had a sense of play and fun. They wanted the Castlecrag community to enjoy the social life, enjoy the environment, hence the picnics and the Punch and Judy shows and the kids' parties. It was Marion who held the community together and who was the energiser. It was her and Walter's overriding ideals that cemented the community.
They had strong progressive ideas all their lives, and they were interested in all sorts of alternative forms of life and cultural expression, and also alternative religion as well. From 1926 onwards, they became quite close to the very strong Theosophical Society in Sydney at that time, then into the work of Rudolf Steiner and anthroposophy in about 1930 and 31. It was an all-embracing set of alternatives to the mainstream culture. And what I think the Griffins got from that was a sort of validation of their previous ideas.
Anthroposophy was very much about exploring your spiritual connection with other people, but also with your environment through creativity. So creativity was very much a part of the Castlecrag community. A lot of the residents were members of the Anthroposophical Society. As well as that, Marion was very much into drama.
She appeared on the stage at MIT as a student at MIT, the first woman to appear on the stage. Previously, all the female roles have been taken by men. And so she had great courage, great energy, great passion.
She was behind the residents building an open-air theatre in Castlecrag in the early 1930s called the Haven Theatre.
Apparently she saw this little valley and she decided that it should be the place of a community theatre, because in the Griffin's, dream suburb, every community should have a theatre. And Marion and her team, they were called the Neighbourhood Circle, and they would have play readings and then put on big productions here, like mainly Greek tragedies.
And these staging of these plays was very imaginative and very extraordinary in this beautiful bushland gully. And that gives it something very ancient feel. And so the plays were playing out the abstracted psychological conditions of Greek plays. And they were fantastically influential in Sydney, with hundreds of people coming to them at the time.
She was incredibly energetic, and I think put a lot of effort into making these theatrical productions quite professional.
The production was quite challenging because there was no formal stage. A beautiful creek runs through the middle of the gully, and at that time, that part of the estate did not have any houses at all, and so that could have a high-level stage on the road itself. Griffin did this Greek temple, making columns out of the cores of newsprint rolls. And then the rocks, the great sandstone floater rocks, were also used, like the Prometheus rock. And then people would be dressed in the Greek costume and so forth, and then light it with flares and carbide lamps and so forth in different ways. And so when that's lit up at night, it's just extraordinary. The combined effect was a total work of art.
After Marion went back to Chicago in 1938, she actually gave that parcel of land to the local council. So it's now a community-owned piece of land, which is a wonderful thing.
Because Griffin left in 1935, Marion, she was back in Castlecrag until the end of 1938. So she was involved in a whole series of these plays. And then they did continue a little bit after Marion's return to the United States. And then when the war came, they couldn't have flares and lights and things on the harbour.
And it just fell into disrepair. Nobody used it. It was just weeds grew. It actually turned into a bit of a dump.
It was like a ruin when I was a child. It was all overgrown with weeds, and sometimes we used to like to burrow down there and find the ancient stones that had been the seats.
It was largely forgotten until the early 70s. And then the local conservation society decided to restore it, and they discovered all of these stone seating. But they did build a stage at that point.
On Christmas Eve every year, we would go to the Haven for the carols, because so special.
One of the productions that was specially written for the amphitheatre was Marion's Gift, which had over 50 local people involved. And there were also 2 giant puppets of Marion and Walter. There's been some absolutely magical performances down here. These are days of old, I'm afraid, now. The council had the stage demolished They could have, you know, structurally fixed the little wooden stage that we had, and if that had been the case, we would still have a theatre here today. But instead, because of all these regulations with access, it now means it's going to be impossible for us to have the stage back the way we had it. So that's a really sad part of the Haven.
We hope that sometime soon they'll sort out the various issues, because it's a bit of a political stalemate at the moment.
It's very sad that it's not in use. It would be a pity to see it slip back into oblivion.
Well, they have been working on building a new stage to it, but it hasn't happened yet.
Last Christmas, we had the carols back, which was wonderful, and the choir stood over there in amongst the trees and the ledges. I mean, it wasn't perfect by any stretch, but at least we were back here and people really loved being back in this space.
The public pathways and reserves, I think, are a really important aspect of the Griffins' work.
Castlecrag is full of little secret walkways. The idea was to keep the cars on the road, tiny little roads, and the people would wander through paths behind the houses.
We used to explore the different pathways through the Griffin estate, and there was some pathways that we were sure nobody else knew. That was our secret.
And we would always take all the shortcuts and through people's houses, which always seemed a bit weird, but it also kind of felt a bit special that we knew the secret way to get to the shops. Yeah.
And that's one of the things that makes Castlecrag really special, is the proliferation of ways to get places. And sometimes you're walking up someone's driveway, and that may feel in modern society very strange, to walk up someone's driveway to get to the shops. But really, that aspect of community living, to share the space with your neighbors. If you've got a shortcut, well, come on in. That's pretty cool.
Well, the thing is with Castlecrag, it wasn't just the houses, it was the people too. They used to have meetings, and socially there was quite a bit done with the other people on Castlecrag.
There was this kind of intellectual tradition of discussion and reading and that sort of thing. A lot of people would come, a lot of really old people would come and sort of sit and talk about, you know, the Iliad and issues, and, you know, I think some of those people had lived here in the time of the Griffins. And definitely when I was born in the 40s, there was still very much a feeling of being in the wake of the Griffins. But there was a lot of stuff that happened after the war, with the new houses being built and bushland being cut down. It was sort of like nobody was interested in the past. It was sort of like an obliteration. But the old timers, you know, would make a few like snide remarks. Oh, Marion wouldn't have liked that, or something, you know.
I can remember that after the Second World War, a lot of building took off, and it got to the stage where you don't know your neighbours. In the early days, there were a lot fewer people, and so you got to know them all.
There are three waves of Castlecrag people. There are the original Castlecrag people, who the roots go right back into the 20s. We would be the next wave of people who came here, you know, just because it was a nice place to live. But the next lot, they talk about having mega mansions down by the water.
What we're finding is that the little houses of the past are being demolished for very large houses, and we're losing the primacy of the bush and the canopy of the trees and the views and vistas through greed, which is tragic. So once again, in Griffin's scheme, the lots were relatively small because there was the larger amount of open space, of public open space within the blocks. And so now when people can build to the property lines and so on, they're losing the sense of space flowing around, incidents within the bush instead of statements of middle class aspiration.
The suburb is much more dense than they ever wanted it to be, and there are
red roofs.
There are red roofs. There are there's large structures that are, I'm sure, larger than they would have been comfortable with. Culturally, I think there is continuity. When we get together as a neighbourhood, as a community, we actually do talk about what the ideas were, what the philosophy of the suburb was. It's not just a suburb. There is a philosophy around the suburb, and it's in books. Which plenty of us own those books. It's documented there, and it's also just part of our discussion with our neighbours. There's so much value that we do take out of that philosophy, and particularly when everyone's living it.
We know our neighbours very well. Christmas party on the street. It is a very community-oriented place. Bush care groups in every neighbourhood.
It does lend itself to be a community place. The infrastructure's there. What we do with it, well, it involves the people.
I feel like the community here has been through obviously many cultural cycles over the years, and certainly I would count us among the people who are not only in the Griffin houses but in Castlecrag at the moment, who are really excited by that communal culture, by living in neighbourhoods, not just suburbs.
A very important time in their lives was the few months that Marion was with Walter in Lucknow in India, a time of incredible production of amazing ideas and beautiful, beautiful drawings. Griffin then, of course, very sadly died in February 1937. He was only in his 61st year. It was very sad. He died of peritonitis following a perforated gallbladder. And characteristically, Marion was working on a drawing at that time. And so there's a very beautiful drawing of the proposed library for the Raja of Mahmudabad. And so that was being drawn by Marion while Walter lay dying. It's really very, very moving in that respect.
She came back to Castlecrag on her own and sort of, struggled, I guess. She would have been very grief-stricken. But I'm sure the community helped to ease that grief, but decided to return to Chicago in 1938. One of her big projects after she returned was bringing together her memoirs in what she called the Magic of America. It covers the whole incredible range of her career and Walter's career.
And it's set up in terms of their life experiences. Every chapter is a battle. The imperial battle about their time in India, the federal battle, of course, that's the Canberra story, the municipal battle, which is Castlecrag, and the personal battle, or the individual battle, which is their lives together.
On the whole, it's a very, very important record over 3 continents and over 4 decades.
So she lived, however, in a form of poverty, really. She did not have much money. In a sense, she was not in any way able to have a very comfortable old age. She had been looked after by her niece as her memory began to go. And Marion died in 1961.
She basically was buried in a pauper's grave, but in the late 1990s she was reinterred at Graceland Cemetery in Chicago, and a suitable plaque was devised.
For a long time the basic facts of her life were not acknowledged. People didn't know when she was born, when she died, when she married, and when all these facts were wrong in the published records about her. Since that time there's been a lot of work done, but it's still a challenge because she subsumed her personality to a very large extent, her artistic and architectural creativity to Griffin. But there's enough fantastic clues to sort of get a sense of her amazing capacities.
I think as a woman ahead of her time, she should be more influential than she has been. And I think you have to look at what she has left, her legacy, in a very kind of holistic way. So it's not just about architecture, it's not just about art, it's not just about design, it's not just about nature, horticulture, whatever. It's all of those things combined. She did, obviously in later life anyway, see her life as a series of kind of struggles against the bureaucracy, against arrogance, against those who didn't share the kinds of beliefs that she and Walter shared. And so what comes across is that she, you know, the determination to have those ideals, the democratic, the social, the environmental, for them to be carried through her whole life, right to the end, is a huge credit to her. And in the background, of course, was the fact that she was a woman promoting these ideas in a man's world. There was that kind of feminist battle happening as well in the background. But I think she was so strong, she had such incredible fortitude and determination that, you know, she just never let it get her down.